Hello and welcome. My name is Sharon Dower and I'm an area demonstrator for 3 counties and South Wales. I'm also a national teacher and I'm part of the National Education Committee. And I've come along today to show you a very quick method you can use to create some frameworks or some structures using the copper mesh. Now, we often use the copper mesh as a mechanic inside a container to hold our flowers into position instead of using floral foam. But this particular brand of copper mesh, which is by Oasis Products, is probably not your best option because it does rust quite quickly when it's incorporated with water. So today I'm just going to show you how you can use it to maybe create a framework for a hand-tied bouquet or something to go around the outside of a plain or an inspiring container. Now we're going to change the camera angle so that you're looking down on the table so you have a much better view of how I create this technique, and we'll see you back in a moment. Okay, so now you can see that we've changed the camera angle so you're looking down on the table, and you can see I've just cut a small section of the copper mesh, and I'm going to show you how you can use the mesh to weave foliage in between each small section there. Now I've got yucca foliage, so a good example of linear material, but you could have New Zealand flax or bear grass or steel grass even. It could be dried materials that you might be storing at home. And what I'm going to do is to create myself a structure, which I'll show you when we put the camera back in the other position. But what I'm going to do is just weave my yucca foliage in and out of each section. So nothing too technical. That will show you just weaving through the copper mesh. And I've left the copper mesh the colour it is when you buy it because it makes it more visible for you to see on the camera. But of course, if you wanted to hide it and make it a little bit more inconspicuous in your flower design, then you could have sprayed that green before you started. Now I'm weaving following the same pattern. You could go in opposite with your weaving so that you have the copper mesh showing intermittently through the middle. But for speed, I'm just going to go the same way all the way through. And you get then to see that it creates a structure or a framework which is held in position by the copper mesh here at the bottom. And what you can do with that is either stand it upright, or you could lay it down. You could have pieces coming in opposite sides so that you get more of a symmetrical shape. And then because I've left these prongs here on the bottom, if you cut the foliage off at the base, you'd be able to insert that into some floral foam, whether it's fresh or dried. You could put it in some sand, and then you'd be able to stand that upright within a flower arrangement. So that's just using some yucca foliage, and I'll show you that in a completed design in a moment. Then what you can also do with the copper mesh, you'll see with this one, I've just added some kebab sticks on either side. And if you want to extend or heighten your arrangement, then you have that ability by adding some kebab sticks on either side. Again, if you think about how flexible the copper mesh is, it's very malleable. You can bend it and get curved shapes. You could square it off. You can make sections of it so you have more than one piece, which will help to create some depth. And then what I've done with this one here, this is a copper mesh that I've cut into almost a square shape, and I've left a gap here in the centre. And that gap could either be for a vase, you could sit it on top of a vase, or you could create a collar around the outside with your materials. I've used just your ordinary moss there, that's the Spanish moss or the tillandsia, and it's really just been inserted into the various holes within the copper mesh. That would make a really attractive collar or a framework around a flower arrangement. And then these sections here, these are just rolled pieces of ribbon. So they're offcuts of ribbon. If I just pull this one out for you to see. It's a Christmassy ribbon that I'm not going to be using anymore, and I've just rolled it around on itself and then inserted it. Now you can either push it into the hole in that manner, but you need a few of them to support one another, or what I've done just to secure them is place them either side of the copper mesh there and staple them to keep them secure. Then you could continue that style all the way around so that you've got a completed collar or something to go around a container. Again, it could make a nice wall hanging, and you could add test tubes to hold your flower material in, but it's really quite versatile. So remember as well, don't just use it flat like I'm giving you an example of here. Bend it and shape it so you get a three-dimensional effect rather than it being flat and two-dimensional. And then what I've also done with a longer piece of the copper mesh is, again, it's just offcuts of wrapping that we use in floristry. So this is almost like a spider web type fabric. It's very soft, almost see-through. I've cut it into strips and various sizes and just scrunched it up and inserted it there in different ways into the holes. This one I've left long so that we've got lots of wispy movement. This one I've rounded off so we get a completely different shape. And then this one here is pieces of offcuts of cellophane. You know, all those things that you've got in a drawer in the house that sometimes you don't know what to use. Think about how the copper mesh could be used to support it. And then again, you could use this as a framework. You could have a container in the centre. You could use it flat. It would make a fantastic wall hanging. But it really brings in some interesting textures. And you could mix the colours up. Really quite pretty. I like that one. So what I've done with the copper mesh is I've made sure I had a long enough piece to wrap around my small container, and I'm just using a very simple jam jar because I felt that you would have something very similar to this at home. And I've made a long length and I've weaved my foliage in and out as I showed you in the technique, and then I've bent it into a complete circle, used part of the copper mesh at the back to hold it together so that it doesn't flap about and fall apart. And then at the front, to create a more dominant section for my focal area, I've bent some of the foliage together. And I've also split the yucca foliage into smaller sections so we get lots of different shapes repeated there at the front. And it gives me a really good contrast at the front against those very vertical visual lines at the back. This gives me movement, it gives me a contrast in shape and texture, and strengthens the focal point for me, which is going to be here at the front of my design. And it also means that I have a section here in the centre that I can place my flower material into. That then sits quite comfortably over my container. The container gives me some visual weight there at the bottom. And for this design, I've chosen just a very simple orchid. Now, I appreciate at the moment that you might not be able to have such an exotic flower available to yourselves in the house, but you could, when you're doing your shopping, select an orchid plant from your supermarket, because you quite often get the phalaenopsis available at a reasonable price, and you could create this type of style to go around your flower pot. So even if you don't want to do a flower arrangement, you can always create this type of design to decorate a very plain flower pot or a house plant that you might already have at home. And what I've done with my simple orchid, I've just created some height material there at the back, and that's a very good example of linear lines which will help repeat the shape of my yucca leaves there at the back. I've also brought in just a very simple piece of the asparagus fern, which will give me a variety of texture and help to bring my eye down forward over the container. And I've arranged all that in a very simple test tube. Just again so you have an idea of something to do not using floral foam. And then that is just going to very simply sit in that section I left there in the middle, so that we create quite a dramatic design, but not using a whole host or a whole variety of different flower types. So if you can't get hold of one of these more exotic orchids, then I've also chosen some simple daffodils. Of course, one of my favourite being the symbol and the emblem of Wales. It could also be flowers from your own garden. Tulips are very easily available at the moment. And I've created the same sort of structure, but this time using branches from the birch tree. Now these I've bought in from the supplier, so they're all very similar in height and length, but you could go out and forage or use items that you might have already collected at home. And what I've done with this one is exactly the same technique. So the copper mesh is holding all my upright branches in position, and I've weaved them through in exactly the same manner. And just to create a little bit of interest, I've circled around with the cotoneaster plant. This cotoneaster is one that drapes down over a wall, so it's quite flexible and has a lot of movement in it. So it was easy to manipulate around my framework. But you'll see it's just exactly the same principle. And you can even use that as a freestanding design. You don't have to incorporate any fresh flowers in there. Again, you could decorate a flower pot or a planted arrangement. You know, use your imagination and see what you can come up with. Now you might recognise my little container. Possibly like me, you've been eating quite a lot of chocolates over the last year or so, which isn't very good for your waistline. But this is a box that Ferrero Rocher chocolates come in, and it's a nice square, neat, small container. I filled it up with some of these river stones that we can buy commercially, or of course it could be sand or gravel or some decorative stones that you might have at home. You could also put some stones, some aggregate stone that you might have in your garden pots outside. But that does two things. It gives me some weight, and it also gives me a contrast in textures and colours alongside the framework. And normally I would have filled that with water. I'm just going to take a few out. You would fill that with water so that your little daffodil here has a water source. I've made this one a more rectangular shape, and hopefully I can get that back over the top. Fits nice and snugly on there. And then quite naturally, without too much pattern or too much thought, we can incorporate these gorgeous little daffodils into the design. And I have done this with tulips, and the tulips cascaded wonderfully in between that framework and the structure. Now I have 2 bunches of daffodils here, and you know, you could make this as tall or as short as you wanted it to be. You could make it longer to fit over maybe a flower, window box. And I'm not worrying too much about it. I'm going to leave enough space in between those daffodils so when the head's open, it's not too overcrowded. You could always add in some taller foliage in there if you wanted to. Lots of catkins and pussy willows about at the moment. And if you wanted to, and I've inserted mine so they all go down into the water source that I've got, but you could of course attach test tubes there on the outside and sit some flowers around the outside. You can of course, if you had flowers that last out of water far better than the daffodils, then you could have them just arranged within the framework itself. So you get a far more abstract version of a flower arrangement, and you could of course attach test tubes onto the end there as well so they last better out of water. So once you create the framework, whether it's with twigs or leaves or fabric or any materials that you have in the house, then you can just play around and enjoy the structures that you've created. So I hope that's given you a little idea of what you could maybe do at home at the moment. Some very small, simple techniques using the copper mesh as a framework or a structure. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you very soon. Bye for now.